Well, hello and a very warm welcome. Thanks for tuning into News9 Live. That particular words on your screens right now. News9's bid to unmask the United Nations Security Council and the hegemony and the power it wields, our little nuanced take on it. History of international conflict would tell us that there arose a need for a global peacemaker to come in existence. The United Nations, an international organization founded in 1945, after the Second World War by 51 countries committed to maintaining international peace and security, developing friendly relations among nations and promoting social progress, better living standards and human rights. Sounds so nice to hear, but in reality, has it been able to live up to the standards? Right up until the unfortunate events that unfolded on 9/11 and its huge ripples, the effects of which are still being felt in the Middle East, no international governing body was even worried about tackling terrorism with an iron fist. Certainly today, the world works in a different way. Now reality is different. The erstwhile 50-odd countries have grown to 193 countries, and underlying calls for reforming the United Nations can be heard. Pakistan in the United Nations. Shehbaz Sharif, the recent statements coming from Pakistan on terrorism and how India has been trying to counter those particular statements in the United Nations General Assembly. But with an ineffective anti-terrorism strategy and just 5 permanent members, indispensable rather, calling the shots, the United Nations Security Council, does it really reflect the current geopolitical realities? And the question that we're trying to ask is, should the 77-year-old global peacekeeper be reformed? We're going to discuss this with the man behind the documentary and also experts on the panel. But before that, News9 Plus's documentary, Unmasked, only on our application News9 Plus. You can download it from the Google Play Store and the Apple App Store. We'll continue discussing about it, but first, here's a snippet. Take a look.
Our country faced the horrors of terror long before the world took serious note of it. Over the decades, terrorism, in different names and forms, tried to hurt India.
During COVID, we had unrelenting cross-border terrorism from Pakistan.
Tell me one problem that the UN has solved.
Fighting terrorism is a central priority for the action of the United Nations.
The UN has a fork tongue. You know, they speak with several tongues.
India as a state has been a continuous victim of terrorism for last many decades, and it has come in different forms and manifestations. But there hasn't been a global support in India's fight against countering terrorism. Many countries woke up to terrorism only after the 9/11 attacks, when the Twin Towers were attacked in USA by the Al-Qaeda and affiliated terror organizations.
Before 9/11, all of us were confronting a terrorist in our neighborhood and otherwise the way we could do it to the best of our ability. And you know that for decades, we are having cross-border terrorism from Pakistan. But it was only 9/11 which brought home to the fact that we are now no more dealing with your terrorists and my terrorists.
But even after 25 years, there hasn't been the convention against terrorism that has been adopted by the United Nations, because there's been a deadlock over how terrorism can be defined. Some say that terrorism is also state-sponsored, but some say there are other elements and institutions and groups that are involved in terrorism.
People are not able to rise above their pet political beefs and come and resolutely adopt a definition for terror. And that has been a bit of a disappointment.
There are certain countries who would not like the definition to be too wide. Some others would want it to be limited. So there are many issues that have held up this convention, despite India's pushing it.
India has been a very important leading voice within the UN system, helping to push forward, first of all, the parameters of understanding of terrorism, and helping to identify practical areas how the world can come together to prevent and to punish the crime of terrorism.
समय की मांग है कि यूएन तय करे कि ये चीजें हैं जिसे हम टेररिज्म कहते हैं, ये लोग हैं जिनको हम टेररिज्म के मददगार मानते हैं, ये लोग हैं जिनको मानवतावादी कहते हैं। दुनिया के सामने नक्शा क्लियर होना चाहिए, कौन टेररिस्ट है, कौन मानवतावादी है, कौन टेररिस्ट के साथ खड़ा है, कौन मानवता के साथ खड़ा है, ये विश्व में तय हो जाना चाहिए।
Whether it is prevention, whether it is conflict resolution, whether it is peacekeeping and peace building, the UN is handicapped severely by the fact that the UN Security Council is being run by a group of 5 countries who were victors of the Second World War.
In 1945, when the United Nations was formed, there were just 51 countries. Now we have 193 countries, but we still have only 5 permanent members.
Now, Ambassador Anil Trigunaya, the former diplomat, is going to be joining us on the broadcast. But right now, with me in the studio, Aditya Raj Kaul, Executive Editor, News9 Plus, and the voice behind this journalistic endeavor. Aditya, for the betterment of the viewers, just to refresh their memories, in terms of 9/11, what has the situation been like up until now? And a very pivotal piece and part of the documentary was the definition of the word terrorism as well. Just a mere definition of the word terrorism is, sort of keeping the entire globe to come onto one voice, one particular stage. How has that become a hindrance, and how do we look towards the future as well when we're looking at reformation and the United Nations?
Well, firstly, we have to accept that UN has completely failed on taking any decisive steps in countering terrorism. And this is reflected from the fact that in the year 1996, Kabir, for the first time, India had introduced a comprehensive convention against terrorism at the United Nations, which will be a global voice, a global policy in countering this menace of terrorism, not just in India or in its neighborhood, but all across the globe. It will be a common definition, a common policy that will be reflected upon and taken care of at the United Nations. But there's been a deadlock. Who would imagine that since 1996, there have been several global terror attacks, including the 9/11, including 26/11, including the Indian Parliament attack, Pulwama, Uri, and several others. And yet, there hasn't been any kind of a decisive action that the United Nations has taken. The only few steps that have been taken are against the financial Action Task Force and the FATF and the financing of terror. And apart from that, the bombing that take place, there's a convention on that. But otherwise, a global convention in fighting terrorism is completely lacking, is completely missing. Now, India, as you know, has been one of the biggest victims of terrorism for last more than 3 decades. We've had several terror attacks, mostly from our neighborhood, hatched and planned in India's neighborhood in Pakistan. There are terror groups like Jaish-e-Mohammed, Lashkar-e-Toiba, and Hizbul Mujahideen who are involved in these terror attacks. Now, it took years for India also to convince the United Nations, as per the formula, as per the laws of the UN, that Jaish-e-Mohammed needs to be banned, that Masood Azhar, the chief of Jaish-e-Mohammed, needs to be banned. Hafiz Saeed, the man behind the most brutal 26/11 attacks, needs to be banned. So, why is the UN not waking up to the situation? One of the primary reasons is the UNSC, the United Nations Security Council. Now, Kabir, every time India introduced a motion against Jaish-e-Mohammed, against Masood Azhar, after the Pulwama attack and after the Uri attacks, there was a stiff opposition by who? By China. And China calls Pakistan its iron brother. So every time Pakistan indulges in state-sponsored terrorism in Indian territory of Jammu and Kashmir or otherwise elsewhere, China protects Pakistan at the United Nations. Now, this is the biggest problem. The biggest solution to this is an immediate reform that is required at the United Nations, because the UNSC was formed in 1945. The UN was formed in 1945 according to the circumstances of the World War at that particular time. The victors actually became the UNSC, members. Why not involve India, Japan, Germany, and several other, countries as well, is the biggest question now.
So, probing that further, what kind of changes do you think should be implemented in the UNSC? I know it's not your job, you're not from the policy sector per se, but are there any public, popular opinions doing the rounds in the diplomatic circles?
See, firstly, I'll tell you that we've spoken to 5 incredible people on this subject. One of those persons is Abdullah Shahid, who is the current foreign minister of Maldives, and he has been the most recent former president of the United Nations General Assembly. And one of the most stark things that he says is that during my tenure at the UNSC, at the United Nations General Assembly, I beg your pardon, the UNSC and the UN completely failed. Now, this is the president of the UNGA himself admitting on camera that during his tenure as the president, he saw UNSC falling apart completely. Why was that? It was because there was a Russia-Ukraine crisis that was underway and no consensus could be developed. You know for sure that there was a G20 level foreign affairs ministers meeting that happened in New Delhi. Again, the only sticking point there was Russia-Ukraine crisis. So, there are several important decisions that need to be made. There's consensus that needs to be achieved, and that consensus can only be achieved if other nations are given equal power at the United Nations and not given a stepmotherly treatment that has happened for last many decades. And terrorism remains one of the most challenging aspects right now, even though the focus is completely shifted from Afghanistan, from India, Pakistan to Russia, Ukraine these days. But this is a challenge that will remain, because today it's not just India, Pakistan and Afghanistan who have been, victims, or, Pakistan being the perpetrator of terrorism, but it's a global menace now. We see every other day knife attacks and lone wolf terror attacks taking place in several countries in Europe. We see that happening in the United States. One of the biggest concerns in US these days is domestic terrorism, because anybody can buy, a rifle and go on a shooting spree in schools, pubs, malls, and other places. So terrorism, be it domestic or international, is one of the biggest challenges and menaces that UN has failed to counter. And this is high time that the UN wakes up to the situation, and a convention that was introduced by India in 1996 is adopted.
Well, there's a quotation by, the Biden administration that says reforms of the United Nations Security Council that are impractical and would undermine US interests is something that the United States administration is going to be looking at. But at the same time, putting a little more focus on how Pakistan has postured itself in the United Nations. Shehbaz Sharif's particular statements, part of that particular documentary as well. And Pakistan clearly playing the victim over there. Don't you think the United Nations should come down heavily on that as well? The United States has come out, supported India when it comes to the US McMahon line, when it comes to the renaming of those 11 particular places in that China versus vis-a-vis India tussle. Should the United States administration also take a look at what's happening inside the United Nations? Shehbaz Sharif saying that he's against terrorism, and in fact he's the victim of terrorism, and he's splurging thousands of millions of dollars on tackling and battling terrorism. Meanwhile, there are clear reports and proofs that there is state-funded support to terrorists in Pakistan as well.
One thing, Kabir, that we need to be clear about is that Pakistan is exceptional and excellent at propaganda and messaging. Now, this is not only domestic, catering to a domestic audience, but this is also at the international level. They leave no opportunity to internationalize Kashmir. At the same time, they rake up all these baseless charges against India. We have Shehbaz Sharif currently, who's the Prime Minister of Pakistan, speaking at the UN. In the past, we've had Imran Khan, Nawaz Sharif, or the Bhuttos continuously going on a spree, particularly on Kashmir, against India without any basis, even though there is now increasing evidence that there have been terror camps funded by the Pakistan Army and the ISI inside the Pakistani territory, sheltering these terrorists and terrorism emanating from Pakistan against India and in Jammu and Kashmir. Not just that, for years together, Pakistan has sheltered the Haqqani network, the Taliban, and other affiliated terror organizations as well. So, from which phase can Pakistan actually challenge India at the United Nations is the biggest question right now. But the propaganda spree will only continue. India has also exposed Pakistan continuously at the UN. I'll tell you, most recently, a few years ago, I broke this story where Ambassador Maleha Lodi from Pakistan was holding a photograph of a kid, claiming that this photograph was from Kashmir and how this young girl was targeted and harassed and beaten. But it turned out through a simple Google search that that photograph was from Syria or Palestine, I don't remember exactly right now, but not from Kashmir. So this is the kind of propaganda that Maleha Lodi and others have indulged in. I also once, during my investigation, interviewed one Pakistani ISI spy Ghulam Nabi Fai in USA openly admitted that he was in touch with Pakistani diplomats and was being paid by them to do Pakistani propaganda on Kashmir at the United Nations. So the propaganda is very clear, but it seems that the UN has still not woken up. It's in deep sleep. It's a mute spectator to the continuous harassment and terrorism that is emanating from Pakistan and increasingly becoming a global menace. And if not countered, it could certainly develop into a bigger monster.
And, focusing on Prime Minister Narendra Modi as well, he has become sort of this poster boy for India's voice against terrorism, if not a global voice already. Some really passionate statements and reactions in that documentary as well. And a really interesting question also asked by one of the guests as well. Can India play a part in this UNSC deadlock? Because you've got the 3 versus 2 pretty much most of the times, and these are indispensable forces and there's proper and clear veto amongst them as well. Do you think India can play a role here? Take a look at what's India doing at the global level, the G20s, the Quads. Prime Minister Modi is a global, at a global level, he is being revered so much. Do you think India can play a part here?
See, firstly, I'll tell you that India has remarkably given a strong response to terrorism. Domestically, whenever there was a terror attack, there was a robust response according to the democratic mechanisms that are in place. We've had the Uri terror attack, and immediately after Uri, we had the surgical strike. We had the Pulwama terror attack, in which more than 40 CRPF brave hearts sacrificed their life for the country in Pulwama of South Kashmir. And immediately after a few days, we had the Balakot airstrike by the Indian Air Force. So India has told the UN and the global audience and the international forums that even if you don't take action, even if there's no global campaign against terror, a cohesive voice, India will stand its ground. India will respect territorial integrity and its sovereignty, and to protect the democratic values in Indian constitution, it will certainly attack and give a strong message to Pakistan. So India can certainly play a great role. In fact, I'll tell you, Kabir, we spoke to Ambassador T.S. Thirumurthy during the course of this documentary, and he, while he was at the United Nations, or even before that, when Ambassador Syed Akbaruddin was there, they have played a pivotal role, a significant role, while India had the presidency of the UNSC. And important chapters on terrorism, radicalization, and online radicalization were discussed and debated at the UN. But the deadlock remains at the UNSC for reforms, and the deadlock remains on terrorism. So India is pushing hard, along with global support from several other countries. But it seems there's much more that India and many other countries need to do to achieve this.
Ambassador Anil Trigunayath, a former diplomat, also with us on the broadcast. Ambassador, give us a sense of how you're looking into this. News9 has tried to, sort of unmask the United Nations' ineffective strategies to counter terrorism. A donor-driven structure, so to speak, voluntary funding. How does voluntary funding end up curbing terrorism at a global level? Your viewpoint on that, and if there is any sort of reform idea that you'd like to put forth for the UNSC or the United Nations, please do go ahead.
Well, Anand, the fact is that none of the P5 countries have been serious about the United Nations per se, or for that matter, terrorism or any other major global issues that confront the whole world today, especially the global south. So whenever India had this presidency of the United Nations Security Council, even including this time, it has tried to talk about the key issues. Prime Minister Modi was the first one who, in fact, in 2016, when he went there to the UN, he told that the world has not even been able to define what terrorism is, who a terrorist is. For last 15 odd years, India's proposal for the Comprehensive Convention of International Terrorism has been pending in the United Nations. And basically why? The reason is that there is always a choice. My terrorist versus your terrorist. That has been the good terrorist or a bad terrorist. And then they put the values on them so that they save them somehow. We have seen what China does to the Pakistani terrorists whenever the designation in the 1267 committee is there. We have also seen that the United States itself, which is supposed to be the major champions, did not even bother about what India was doing, what India was suffering from until 9/11 happened. So it's only after 9/11. And the way after 9/11 they did was bombing Afghanistan, bombing Iraq, created more terrorism, actually. Those are the things, the root causes of these. So I believe that there is no real serious business. There are a lot of discussion, a lot of talks. There are strategies. So what India can do perhaps is what India is doing best at the moment is number one, I mean, defend yourself. That's extremely important thing against terrorists, which has been done very significantly in recent times. We have also tried to work together in smaller groups, like in the BRICS, the counter-terrorism strategy, in the SCO's counter-terrorism strategy, or the REDS it's called. India has been coming up with specific proposals with Central Asian countries, with various countries, even including in Afghanistan. So I think that we know that who are from where is the haven of terrorism in Pakistan is, who the terrorists are. But those terrorists have thrived because of the support being given by many countries. And if they do not decide that what is a non-state actor or a state actor, or the state and non-state actors when they are working together. So India has brought this very important idea that any other country which is supporting terrorists and is seen to be doing that, there should be action taken against those. Now, at the moment, the only thing available is FATF, right? You get blacklisted, you get problems inside. And those are the things that give them, Pakistan has been there for the umpteen number of years, several times. Right. But it has not prevented them from promoting terrorism because that is an instrument of their foreign policy. So they learn from their masters, frankly. That's what today the China is the big master. So every time you go that this the terrorist should be designated, this is precisely what the Chinese put a technical hold. We have seen in several cases, and we continue to do so.
Likewise, well, Ambassador Trigunayat, Ambassador, I mean, we're at a shortage of time here, and I must be fair to my journalistic conscience as well. We've been decoding all these points as well, and I again implore the audience to check out that documentary as well. But Ambassador, I must play the devil's advocate here as well. Do you think this is a situation where unable for us to see the hands of the United Nations, the global peacemaker, is tied, and it's a situation of all these countries barking up the wrong tree really quickly?
Well, the UN is a platform for everybody to come and talk and whatever they want to do. At the moment, it is totally ineffective, and we have seen, and it is far more ineffective at a point where P5 countries are involved. So the real villains of the peace are P5 countries and not the United Nations itself.
All right. Ambassador Anil Trigunayat, many thanks for joining with us and helping us out with your insightful inputs. Aditya, always a pleasure speaking to you as well. A great bid by News9, plus to unmask the United Nations, its ineffective anti-terrorism strategies, and also just 5 indispensable members calling the shots. Back in 1945, with just 51 countries, it made sense. But today, we're 193 countries strong, and times have changed. So should the global peacemaker. That's all the time we have for you in this edition. Content continues on News9 Live. Don't go anywhere.